Koala numbers across the country are on the decline and the species is facing the threat of extinction. But koalas in the Blue Mountains are thriving.
While koala numbers across the country are on the decline, in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, an increasingly important population is thriving. These koalas are disease-free and their population is seemingly growing in numbers at a time when the majority of the species is facing the threat of extinction. Dr. Leigh and Dr. Lachlan Pettit are studying the impact climate change will have on the endangered species. An increase in the incidence of heat waves brought about by global warming will have a dramatic effect on koala populations. This is likely to make the Blue Mountains one of the last remaining habitats suitable for the species. This makes the region's koala population critical for its future survival, a glimmer of hope for an animal on the decline. Hamish Cole, ABC News, Bilpin.
Well, to tell us more about why this koala colony will become one of the most important in the country, we are now joined by Dr. Kellie Leigh, the Executive Director of Science for Wildlife. Dr. Kellie Leigh, great to have you on Weekend Breakfast there. As Hamish Cole was saying in his story, this is a glimmer of hope for the koalas in the Blue Mountains. But how does this impact the koalas in the rest of the country?
Yeah, it's one of the really interesting things about the work we're doing in the Blue Mountains is because the habitats are so diverse, what we can learn here about koalas can also apply to koalas in other areas. So we're learning, how they use the landscape under different temperatures, particularly extreme temperatures like climate change. And so by monitoring where they go and what they do, we can understand which parts of the habitats are most important for koalas into the future and how to protect them. And so the work we're doing here has actually got implications for a lot of other areas as well.
So tell us a bit more specifically why the Blue Mountains is so good for koalas in terms of the environment and the conditions that they exist in.
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question because generally people thought that this area wasn't suitable for koalas because it's famous for its sandstone cliff lines and its sandstone soils. And so typically koalas are known to like really good soils. But when you look back historically, say at the fur trade days, koalas were hunted in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The numbers were huge, like millions were unfortunately shot during that time, but they were found throughout the Blue Mountains area. And so what we're finding is they can use a lot of different soil types and a huge amount of tree species. Like there's around 100 different eucalypts here that they can choose from. And so we're learning, what food trees they like, what shelter trees are important, and some more sort of limits around the climate envelope and the areas that koalas can persist in.
How might those conditions be replicated elsewhere when the conditions elsewhere in the country are different?
Yeah, so it can. One of the things we're doing at the moment with support with the New South Wales koala strategies is putting out some temperature probes. So putting them into gullies and on ridge lines and on the koalas as well to see how they move. And so, for example, we might look at, and we've got koalas almost near sea level or sort of 100 metres up on the eastern side of the Blue Mountains up to like 1,000 metres in altitude up in Canangra Void. And so quite different microclimates, different rainfall as well, different moisture levels, which are really important to koalas. And so by working out where they move, it may be that in some areas under extreme temperatures, for example, they might move into gullies, which are much cooler, or they might not. They might sit on ridge lines and just need particular shelter trees. And so when we have that sort of information, it can inform habitat restoration in other areas, for example. We want to know not just which trees to plant, which is really important, but where to plant them and under what conditions. And so that's the sort of information we're hoping. It's going to be guiding habitat restoration through this area and hopefully other areas as well to improve conditions once we know how koalas behave under these certain extreme events under climate change.
So is this about the Blue Mountains rather being a refuge for koalas across the country, or the lessons that are learnt in the Blue Mountains being applied elsewhere?
Yeah, look, it's both. And so there has been, the predictions of extinction you see for koalas, which are pretty frightening, they're based on land clearing. So the focus has been on the good soil types, and there's a lot of important populations there. What we found is, we're putting protected areas back into that, and the risks of climate change and bushfires are an area we really need to put management into as well. And because we do have high altitudes here, high rainfall, cooler temperatures, they are likely to persist in areas like this. you know, compared to out west where the temperatures are going to get really hot and the trees get more heat stress. So the fact we've got 1 million hectares here and you don't have the development threat, that's a really good thing for koalas. So that's absolutely true. But also it is a really interesting site because of its high diversity, where we can learn a lot more lessons about koalas to hopefully help conserve them in other areas as well.
You've touched on temperature there, but what are the main other challenges faced by koalas in the wild?
Yeah, unfortunately, they're many and varied. So habitat loss and fragmentation is a real problem for them in a lot of areas. And with that comes, you know, if koalas don't have access to the best habitats, and that might be from development, it also might be from bushfires. So, for example, we had huge bushfire impacts up here in the Blue Mountains. And so if they don't have access to their most preferred habitats and the most nutritious trees, then it's like with people, you know, if you start losing nutrition, then you're more susceptible to disease as well. So there's interacting factors there. So there's things like heat stress and drought, which reduces their food quality as well. Habitat fragmentation. Down in developed areas, you get domestic dog attacks as well as vehicle strikes. And then within these protected areas, disease and bushfires and climate change are really the big threats. So there is a lot to address across the landscape.
Given all of that, Dr. Kellie Leigh, when you look at the future for koalas in Australia, do you feel hopeful?
I feel more hopeful now, I think, than I have previously. I think because climate change, there's so much more awareness now. I mean, horribly, a lot of people have been impacted by it. You know, it's particularly in recent years with the floods, bushfires. You know, it's once you get impacted by it and you see it happening, I think we're at the stage now where there's really high awareness and more willingness to help. And koalas are certainly on the agenda. They became the ambassador for the bushfires and their impacts on wildlife. And so there is more momentum now than we've seen before. And so I am hopeful. There's an awful lot of work to do. But if we can hang on to koalas and their habitats, we'll also be benefiting a whole range of other species as well.
Yes, good point. Dr. Kellie Leigh, great to have you on Weekend Breakfast this morning. Thank you.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.